It's great to have this briefing here in Europe because, and have this international presence, because it's really the case that Europe are the world experts at wasting food. So you can learn a lot about how to squander a food supply by touring the continent. What I've shown here, and for more details, just go to my book, Waste Uncovering the Global Food Scandal. I'm not going to have time to discuss this data in any detail. This shows every country in the world. Each dot represents a country in the world, and it shows the food supply in that country as a percentage of the nutritional requirements of its population. So a theoretical country that had 100% of the nutritional requirements of its population and no more would fall on the 100% mark on the left-hand axis. Obviously, there is always going to be some waste. There is always going to be unequal distribution of food, and therefore agronomists agree that a country that has 130% of the nutritional requirements of its population has a relatively secure food supply. And you can see that as countries get richer, GDP goes up along the bottom axis. All countries rush towards that mark of 130%. But then, obviously, as countries get more wealthy, they invest more in more food and more food production and imports of food, and they head up to that region between 150 and 200% of the nutritional requirements of their populations. And you can see that all rich countries, all Western European countries and North American countries fall within that mark, 150 to 200% of nutritional requirements. So I should just emphasize this is, of course, after exports and imports have been taken account of. This is the food available in the shops and restaurants to that population in that country. But the thing that really struck me when I finally plotted this mass of data was how the countries get, actually the pattern levels off. There's a very steep rise as countries acquire wealth, but then a leveling off. The investment in further and further surpluses looks, according to this data, like it doesn't go above 200%. However, I unpacked that data one level further because I wasn't satisfied that that would be the case, and found that, in fact, that is indeed a mirage. If you take into account the edible foods that rich countries decide to feed to their livestock to increase meat and dairy production, as in taking account of all the maize, wheat and soy that people choose to feed to animals but which could have been eaten by people, you find that the food that each country has available to it but chooses not to use for human consumption reaches, in the case of the United States, for example, 4 times the nutritional requirements of its population. So when we talk about increasing production globally, when we talk about the need to feed those 9 billion people that are expected on the planet by 2050, I always bear in mind these charts because, of course, there is an unprecedented, a historically unprecedented level of surplus in rich countries. There is an enormous buffer, a totally hitherto unprecedented buffer between us in rich countries and hunger. Where does all that food go? We've heard a little bit from Robert and his study on food waste, and I'll whiz through. This is a typical site that I see on my hobby, which is unofficial bin inspections. They do have to be unofficial, unfortunately, because there is no supermarket in Europe, no supermarket chain, that allows third-party access to its waste data, any independent auditing or actual surveys or studies of actually what goes into their bins. So one has to make inquiries of one's own. This is very typical. It's the result of overstocking primarily. There's also the issue of date labels, which can cause confusion and cause products to pass their expiry date or near their expiry date without being sold. Price reductions is one of the ways in which this particular supermarket has attempted to sell some of that surplus and obviously failed. You can see the price reduction labels on there. Some supermarkets have become very, very good at redistributing to charities this kind of surplus. It's all fit for consumption, Other organisations, well, for example, the supermarket chain in Norway called Kiwi has an automatic 50% discount for food the day before its expiry date, and on the expiry date you can pick it up for free. So there are ways of avoiding this kind of waste, and obviously when the likes of Walmart and Tesco advertise that what developing world countries need is investment in their food supply chain in order to modernise and in order to increase efficiency, if that's true, if it's true that rich countries' kind of know-how and expertise and investment can make developing world countries' food supply more efficient, it has to come with an avoidance of the kinds of food waste mechanisms that have developed in Western food systems. And unfortunately, there's no sign that that would necessarily be the case. Quite the contrary. We've heard a little bit about supermarket food waste, but what I found when I did my research is that actually the food thrown away by supermarkets themselves is really a tiny percentage of the food that they cause their suppliers to waste. Their principal achievement, if you like, is to offload waste onto their suppliers, thereby eliminating the inefficiency, the economic inefficiency of waste from within their own business models. This is an example of the kind of thing that you find. This is a sandwich factory supplying one of the supermarkets in Britain, and they were throwing away 13,000 slices of fresh bread from this single factory every single day when I first visited their factory in 2008. I'm pleased to say that subsequent to my visit, the company, instead of sending it to landfill, they had started sending it for anaerobic digestion. I suggested they could save money by feeding it to livestock. They did that, and it saved them £100,000 a year in waste disposal costs. So there are sort of mitigating kind of circumstances for this particular example, but it is an example of a supermarket saying we don't want the crust. They also didn't want the slice inside the crust, so 4 slices of bread were being thrown away for every loaf going into that factory because the supermarket didn't want these different shaped slices. That's obviously not a maximum use of resources. Go one level up. We've heard about cosmetic standards laid down by supermarkets. I won't go into it in depth, but suffice it to say this farmer is a classic example. He wasted £16,000 worth of spinach. Not a leaf of this spinach was harvested because there's a little bit of grass growing in amongst it. Potatoes that are cosmetically imperfect, all going for pig feed rather than human consumption. Parsnips that are too small for the supermarkets in Britain. And of course we export this kind of cosmetic waste to other countries. This is Ecuador last year, and this was the pile of waste about 2/3 of the way through one day of harvesting on one banana plantation. Why? Because they're cosmetically imperfect. They're not in big enough bunches. For whatever reason, they've been eliminated not just from the export market to Europe, but even the export market for the regional consumption of bananas. These are none of them going for human consumption. That's Costa Rica, tomatoes in Tenerife, oranges in Florida. The list goes on. Now, if we do this with fruit and vegetables, which we've heard a bit about, you can bet that we also in Europe do this with animals. Offal consumption, I mean the livers, the lungs, the kidneys, the hearts, the heads, the tails, all of these bits and bobs. Offal consumption in Britain and in the United States has halved in the last 30 years. That means that we are using our livestock in a very, very inefficient way. And in fact, it's Europe that needs to relearn the principle of nose-to-tail eating. This is a man from Xinjiang province in western China, and he's serving up his national dish called sheep's organs. They eat absolutely everything when they kill an animal, and quite right too. Of course, our fishing industry is notorious for its waste. In fact, the European Common Fisheries Policy enforces the waste of food, the waste of fish at sea, and between 40% and 60% of all fish fished in European waters are thrown overboard. They're never even landed. We have now got a piece of legislation which looks like it will be passed with a delay, which we can't afford, but you know it's better than nothing, to ban or reduce discards at sea. Now, of course, European fleets fishing in foreign waters probably won't abide by this principle, and therefore different regions will have to adopt their own measures to try and prevent the wasteful practice that European fisheries indulge in. Consumer waste, I won't go into actually, because we've got Andy Dorr later talking about consumer waste in Britain, but just to summarise, there's a lot of skills that have been lost in Western countries regarding food waste, and it is possible to relearn them. Very simple things. This is 3 lettuces bought at the same time from one supermarket. The one on the left was left on the dining room table, ambient temperature. The one in the middle was stored in the fridge, and a lot of people think that it's right to keep a lettuce like this in the fridge. The one on the right was, as you can see, kept like a cut flower in a vase of water, and lasted a good deal longer. Now, I cannot talk about food waste in Europe without touching on the issue of feeding food waste to livestock. Some food will always be wasted, and the question then is, what is the best thing to do with it? This is an example of a Japanese food waste recycling plant, and they're taking food waste from department stores and restaurants. It goes to this factory. It's pasteurized, it's cooked, so it's completely sterile, and then it's inoculated with a lactobacillus. Basically, they make a food waste yogurt, which goes out to pig farmers like Kame-san. And he raises his pigs on this food waste. He saves 50% of his feed costs as a result. He's very happy, as you can see. And he sells his pork back to the very same supermarket that gave him the waste as eco-pork. Unfortunately, this practice is illegal in Europe. Instead of this guy gets a 50% subsidy from the government of Japan to invest in all those gutters to transfer from a conventional feed system, imported maize and soy, to the food waste system. But in Europe, as I say, it's illegal. It's been illegal since 2001. Just to clarify, this is not to do with mad cow disease. It's not a BSE issue. It's foot and mouth and classical swine fever, which can be carried by food waste if you don't cook it. So the solution to that problem is to cook it. Just like human food, we expect to buy meat and cook it. We should be doing the same for livestock, and it's high time Europe reconsidered its position on this environmentally catastrophic piece of legislation, which results in the increased import of the 40 million tons of soy that we import from South America every year, where, of course, its production contributes to deforestation. This is just to indicate the environmental benefits of feeding food waste to pigs relative to the next best option, which is now being promoted both in Europe and also globally, and that is anaerobic digestion. Feeding food waste to an anaerobic digester produces renewable energy, which is obviously great, but feeding it to a pig produces pork and manure, which you can then, in fact, use for anaerobic digestion, but also fertilizer. And this indicates just how much better it is to feed it to pigs. And therefore, when I go, for example, to Chennai wholesale market, the biggest vegetable and fruit market in Asia, and see that somebody has invested money in an anaerobic digestion plant, which unsurprisingly isn't used because, in fact, the livestock come in and eat all the waste fruit and vegetables, which is much more appropriate technology. We knew this in Europe during the war. We fed our food waste to pigs, and they were very happy with it. So that, I think, will summarise, just to finalise on the general principle. Everyone's, I think, familiar with the food waste pyramid. This is an education tool for food company managers that we've developed. It's online. You can have a look at it, and it links waste producers with waste users, whether it's charitable redistribution or livestock feed, and then failing those two options, the waste management options at the bottom of the hierarchy. Thank you very much.